how many U-turns can one Prime Minister make? You'd ask yourself in the wake of, I can't even remember, is it 5, 10, who knows? But actually, within hours of Kier Starmer promising there would be no more U-turns, he's U-turned again on local elections that were being postponed in England to let reorganisation take place. Well, now Reform has won its legal battle to force them to take place as planned. That's going to be one heck of a guddle. That's going to be one heck of a lot of public money. Our money ending up being paid to blasted Reform for taking the legal challenge in the first place. If that isn't just the mother of all guddles, you'd wonder. And of course, the local elections are likely to be so disappointing for Labour anyway. Is this now a shoe-in for Reform? Or are we in danger of getting carried away with ourselves, as some of the polls suggest a bit of flatlining? We talk about all of that, the Community Wealth Building Act in Scotland, Jim Radcliffe sitting in his Monaco fastness, throwing pelters at migrants as if he's not one, and much else besides. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's Leslie Riddick podcast. Well, it's been quite a delicious guddle of a week. Leslie, fact is what we should actually be talking about. I'm constantly, we're both making sure that we kind of steer onto Scottish things rather than being dragged off into other Westminster malarkey. But it's just one thing after another with these people. And
it is kind of like that. Just before we get anywhere else, just to sort of say in the middle of it all, though, did you watch the rugby?
No, but I was. I'd go and pick something up in Edinburgh, and I happened to sort of skirt past, kind of in the Murrayfield-ish area, and I saw that there were some stands up, so I knew that Scotland were playing. I didn't realise that prior to.
I mean, well, the thing is, I was going to say Pat will be, sitting slightly furious somewhere, but I don't know what his attitude was. I think he's a broad enough kirk of a sort of sporting man that he would have watched all of it.
Well,
but I mean,
I don't think he's a big rugby guy, I have to say. But
he watches women's cricket, so I mean, fair play to him. But it was amazing. It was another of these ones where you kind of tuned in halfway, and Scotland was ahead. And I actually have had this conversation with other people since then who were exactly the same. They heard that Scotland was ahead, but not by enough to guarantee
that they were safe to watch the rest of it, so they had to run away. Yeah.
There's a real question about your bravery at these moments, because it's horrible, actually, sitting watching and having this sinking feeling. And I know enough football fans to know how many people have just had 97th minute kind of crucifying goals lately. But to think that you're going to sit and watch that lead slip away, it's just unmanageable. So I'm afraid to say, yet again, I bottled it until I was watching it. It's just ludicrous. I was watching it, the tries and whatever coming in, till eventually they got to 31-13. I thought, right, I think we're 10 minutes to go. I think we can watch this now. And then watch some of the highlights. It's just a beautiful thing to see. I don't know, because I'm not much of a flag waving gal and, all that kind of thing. But equally, mentioning this to a pal sent, which I will put a link to, an amazing segue of all the commentators on the Scotland-Denmark football game from across the world. And it's like in their own languages, they just go bonkers. They go as bonkers as our guys did. And it's actually really gratifying that there's just this, maybe they go bonkers for any decent goal, but that'd be a lot of bonkers. So I just kind of, there's something quite lifting at the moment when you see all of this, and it's worth saying before we now descend to the depths. Where are we going? Reforms front bench?
Well, I think we should community wealth building, I think, is much more on trend for us. I mean, that was a great bit of interest, the Preston model and stuff like that, where we just had lunch with Pat, our Christmas lunch for the podcast last week. So it was good to catch up with Pat. We should have had him back on for a special on community wealth building, but the Community Wealth Building Bill has now passed the Scottish Parliament. Some mixed reception, Heather and Jon, but what was your take? I'm hoping that a bit like, well, perhaps not like land reform, that it'll provide a basis for future legislation, and this is kind of an enabling bill, so it'll all be down in the statutory guidance and what have you. into how it actually gets implemented. But there's so many different aspects of how our public bodies procure stuff that people, rightly get upset about, and that doesn't favour the kind of medium-sized butcher that you might have in the town, or people that do office supplies or what have you, particularly. Well, some other, French firm, multinational comes up, promises the earth, can't deliver it, but somehow we're not able to score them on their previous performance. Your local guy goes out of business, and everything's just been kind of extracted in terms of the wealth that could be going into the local community is going off elsewhere. So hopefully this will be a kind of a start to redressing those problems.
Yeah. And I mean, I see Kate Forbes wrote an article in the National, which has stayed in the most read for a gratifyingly long period of time. I think out of curiosity about this, and the headline, which says we are the first country on earth to put this kind of requirement into legislation. Now, I mean, it does feel like kicking yourself in the ankle to say, well, that's true, right? But there have been, this whole model began in Cleveland, actually, in the States, where they just saw all the wealth they had, which was not a lot, starting to leaking out the place by, bigger companies coming in, putting in the lowest bid, clinching contracts, hiring people on terrible wages, disappearing when they didn't feel like it, and then leaving the place absolutely bereft. So they were the ones who started 15 years ago or longer, actually, to just decide they would actually award contracts locally. And that hasn't spread to the whole states at all. It'd be unlikely that anything developed in one state did actually, get to the size of the United States, especially under bugger lugs. But then it was picked up in Britain by the Preston Council, who really went some. And that does mean things like hospitals, councils, universities, any large institution, realising that how they procure everything has a massive impact on local wealth. It also means, which is the bit that hasn't been gone into here, coming back to the Cleveland example, you have to have then, as it were, organisations, because what happens is you might need to have somebody, for example, providing press and public relations. Well, there might not initially be anybody doing that sort of thing, or there might be somebody that does press releases and somebody else that does, I don't know, sort of fulfillment type stuff, sending people things. You would have to bulk up a bit, which meant that in Cleveland they had to create new sort of cooperatives combining different individual businesses until they fitted at the other end what the, universities or whoever else it was required of a business. And for a while, it was a bit ropey because obviously these big businesses are well-oiled machines to the extent that they work until there's some massive problem that nobody has picked up, like the kind of post office stuff.
Aye, but I mean, the part of the problem is that they're not necessarily well-oiled machines in terms of their delivery, but, their procurement team is absolutely rocking and, shit hot at producing tender responses.
Yes,
in a way
indeed.
that your
I'm not
little guy
meaning
is.
to suggest the biggest beautiful stuff works for far more than just, the initial balance sheet look of it. But all I mean is that they at least look like they've got teams that have got some record covering everything.
Yeah.
When you're starting off from scratch, which people will be in every council area probably, you'll have some little cooperatives. Again, go and see the Finland Film, people, if you want to see how cooperatives work when you really believe in them and have done for 100 years. But anyway, that's what is needed, for example, in Finland to get to the stage where you can absolutely rely on cooperative social enterprise and whatever. Now, I'm really hastening to add, there's no track record of any problems with these, cooperatives or social enterprises in Scotland. It's just that they will have to, like Preston, people will have to connect up to be able to fit onto the contracts that are on offer, and the local authorities, the NHS or whatever, will have to break contracts down until they're small enough to be working locally. So all of that was integral to Cleveland and then Preston being a success. And that will be, there's a link that's in the notes from SPICE, which is the kind of information bit of the Scottish Parliament, that explains what this all is and, really well. But for sure, the objectives totally have to be there as a kind of top line. This is what we're going for. And then the devil will be in the detail. And there's quite a lot of people just a wee bit worried about some of the phrasing in it, which is, sort of, can't remember exactly, but duties to act, it needs to specify whether all sorts of organisations absolutely have to get people to jump to it. A lot of these quangos have just got that they have to pay due regard to the principles. Well,
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all there to be done.
I mean, the 2014 Procurement Act was supposed to do some of that as well, and doesn't seem to have managed it. I'm not totally across all the details, but I do remember going to various things in around that time when it was being implemented, that this was all going to be about breaking up contracts and making them more palatable to smaller operators, so that we would have a kind of plethora of SMEs and medium-sized organisations in Scotland able to bid for this public work. It provides, and oftentimes, a much more robust and better produced product. Remember, when we were running the office, the MP's office used to try and get as much as we could locally, because it was a good way of spending that budget that we had, which would keep being called MP's expenses when it's really welfare rights office management costs. So all of our kind of what do you call it, office supplies and things like that we could get locally. We weren't allowed to get paper locally because that came as a big sort of job lot from Westminster. But speaking to the local office supply guys, they'd be like, well, actually, we used to supply most schools in the council area, and we supplied all sorts of different bits and bobs of the Scottish government and its agencies across Edinburgh. But, kind of one by one, they all went on to massive framework contracts. And despite being, able to get whatever it was, 98% of anything in the catalogue for next day delivery, the other big, massive multinational office supply companies would come in and claim they could do 100% when they couldn't, and win the contract because they scored ahead. And even the guys that were scoring it knew full well that it wasn't true, but didn't seem to have any powers to prevent it. And they would often kind of, you would order a kind of fancy felt tip or something, and you would get some kind of crappy generic version, and it all just went onto the big contract, and it was all kind of a blob. Whereas your local guys had a much greater kind of customer service, much more responsive to the needs of their customers. Same as during COVID. I know people that run big sort of PPE and kind of janitorial supply firms who had lost contracts for councils or third sector or tertiary education centres, had gone with the big boys because they thought that was more robust. And in times of crisis, we know you can always rely on some giant multinational. And then when it came to a type of crisis, giant multinational just sold all their stuff to the highest payer, ignored the little contracts they had, and all of a sudden all these guys were on the phone going, mind how we ditched you? I wonder if you could get me X, Y and Z. So it should be good for local economies, and for generating more of that kind of German sort of backbone of medium-sized local companies operating across Scotland.
Mm-hmm. We should keep an eye on this, because seriously, we've sent each other a bit of a list of what we think we're talking about, and this week's just gone absolutely bonkers with the amount of, as you aforementioned, guttadeliciousness coming from south of the border. So anyway, I haven't spent as much time as I feel I should on this one, actually, because the other thing is, if you have a quick Google for that, the community wealth building bill, there's almost no coverage of it. It's another of these ones where, because this doesn't make proper headlines in the eyes of, the mainstream media, there's really nothing in it, apart from Kate Forbes' own thing, which, to be fair, is kind of like, it's a wee bit off the money in terms of, I think, of where the challenge really lies, which is this managing to fit things actually in local areas. And then bearing in mind that when you're talking about local in Scotland, sorry to bang the drum again, you're not talking about local. You know, you're talking about the biggest councils in the world. So, okay, that's better than having a sort of, a piece of procurement from the same groups, which are just necessarily going for what is the best value, which was a clause. I can't remember who inserted that one. I think it was Labour back in the day of the Scottish Parliament. I remember John Swinney putting an edict out to councils saying best value doesn't necessarily need to just mean the cheapest bid. But, by that stage, it was an entrenched habit that people felt they had to choose the cheapest bid. So some groups have managed to some councils, I remember Aberdeen Council made a wee change to that, because in their procurement policy, they put a food miles criterion and a freshness thing about food. So that without sort of compromising best value, go to the cheapest, those companies also had to not have huge food miles and had to have really fresh food, which all of which lent towards the local supplier. So there's been all sorts of ways of trying to get round what is nonetheless the overwhelming kind of a pressure on all public bodies, which is still that you've just got to get, it's like, never mind the quality, feel the width still. So if this puts a spanner in the works, grand, we will watch it.
Indeed. Speaking of local governments and local democracy, it's been another U-turn by the Westminster Labour government on their plans to delay council elections as they reorganise in the wrong direction, I think we would say, local government in Englandshire, and that these 30 council elections that were not going to take place because these the sort of structures of local councils were going to change and kind of parish councils were being merged into bigger authorities after a successful or court challenge, at least by Reform UK. They've all of a sudden had to do a swift volte-face, and now they're all going ahead as planned.
I don't know that these were parish councils. I mean, they weren't weenie. They were just...
Well, there's a kind of mixture of
Yeah, but I think it's kind of important, this, and again, this is one where I think in the midst of everything, I'm going to have a little bit more of a look at this, because they're basically trying to change, well, the explanation on the BBC radio this morning was that sort of district councils and county councils, where they overlap. Now, I mean, slap my thigh, but I think the point of having two tiers is that you do have something that's a bit, that's higher up, that's able to make strategic decisions, and that these are now all being turned into unitary authorities with somehow some regional thing at the back of it. So it's complicated, but nonetheless, just as you say, they had decided to postpone these 30 elections. It's pointed out by The Spectator, who, of course, have got a bit of skin in the game here, but whatever. They say, I'm sure it's a coincidence that 21 of the 30 councils were under Labour control. And so this was always thought to be the kind of, a motivation at the back of it was that this is not a good time for those Labour councils, if it was avoidable, to be, basically subject to attack from Reform. But it looks like there was polling done apparently by the Telegraph last month, and this is before the Guddle, the extreme Guddle, suggesting that Labour would lose 10 of the 30 councils. Which is, pretty bad. But you've got to say now you've got a situation where, I mean, if you were in any of these councils, and to be fair, they'll end up with rubbish turnouts because like the whole of Britain, we don't have vibrant, north or south of the border, anything like vibrant so-called local democracy. So they'll end up with a 34% turnout or something like that anyway. And yet, so in many respects, people will be getting angry about having their right to vote removed from them, at the same time not exercise it, But it's the narrative that it creates because, they fought the law and they won, actually, Reform, and they're absolutely lording it today. Because Ed Davey from the Lib Dems was also aghast, that this kind of robbing people of democracy, they didn't put in a legal bid. Same with Kemi Badenoch. So actually, in a way, Nigel Farage has gambled and won by just deciding to do some legal action, which actually the SNP is often very good at as well. Not giving it hot air, but giving it an actual legal challenge. Your former employer herself was a very dab hand at actually doing the business, with the challenging the prorogation of Parliament lark. So you get brownie points for that. You get respect. And here we are. They've just handed it to Reform over this.
Completely. And as you say, a low turnout might favour Reform in some areas that people are sort of scunnered with Labour. You get a reduced in turnout. People are not ready necessarily to vote against you, or some of your supporters, a proportion of your supporters are not ready to vote against you, but neither are they willing to come out and vote for you because they're so scunnered, whilst you've got a kind of ascendant Reform in England sort of snapping at everybody's heels, coming off the back of this court success, and potentially, improving a result that they might not otherwise have had, although they are obviously very far ahead in the polls. But it also, again, it just makes the Labour government very unclear in its sort of ability to carry forward its decisions.
Well, it's classic, because apparently Starmer was on Radio 2 hours before the U-turn, assuring listeners there would be no more U-turns.
Yeah.
So, I mean, even if this all seems rather Pyrrhic victories and sort of, a bit kind of, where's the beef of all the real problems in life, you do begin to wonder if anybody's got their hands on the wheel at all with this stuff. And of course, there's the extra point that Kier Starmer is, we all know he's got a, gosh, I was going to say, I've suddenly forgotten what his father was, a tool.
No, he said a tool maker. My father was a tool maker.
And so we know that. And we also know he was Director of Public Prosecutions, so he's supposed to be the guy who's just got a naturally legal bent, and he didn't spot there was going to be a legal challenge, a likely successful challenge to just deciding that 4.6 million voters would lose their right to vote. I mean,
it wasn't like it was coming along in 12 months time. I think it was 2 years if they get all of their reorganisation in place and are ready to rock. So it was going to be quite a significant delay. I mean, you feel sorry for the actual people in councils, and obviously having to kind of work quite closely with electoral officers and what have you, particularly an excellent team in Edinburgh elections, even doing the 2024 election, which everybody had penciled in for November, and then all of a sudden came flying unexpectedly in June when Rishi Sunak had a rush of blood to his head or couldn't stand it any longer and decided to just hand over to Labour. That caused all sorts of problems, and various people who had long-standing holidays and things all booked had to just unbook them and make themselves available, and there's really not going to be a huge amount of time for people to get organised. And I suppose it affects the campaigns as well. You would have normally, we've been talking about, the beginning of the 100-day period, or the regulated period that began in the beginning of January. You'd be expecting to bed in new candidates, announce them, and start kind of getting your campaign organised. That's all now been kind of concertinaed towards the election. And one does wonder whether the Labour Party will be in any fit state to fight the election that's coming up. Well, speaking of disastrous Labour Party shenanigans, having lost Morgan McSweeney last week, seems thick and fast. We've now got another scandal sort of surrounding him and his cronies, and in the funding scandal continuance of problems that they had with Labour Together, which was a kind of internal think tank group that actually propelled Kier Starmer to victory in the first place, was investigated by the Times on its failure to declare various donations. They had very large donations, and then as a kind of spiteful action, this internal group went off and spent 30 grand. I'm sure there's plenty of independent groups out there who'd be quite happy to commission 30 grand's worth of proper research, never mind opposition research, as they would call it in the US, looking into the motivations of journalists.
Yeah, and actually, the guy who is the director of Labour Together, Josh Simmons, he was the guy who said this a while ago. Why don't you send the smuggler gangs and put them on the barge that has been set aside for asylum seekers and ship the barge up to the north of Scotland for all I care? That was kind of sweet.
Basically, like Rwanda, it'd be as much of a disincentive to be, stuck in the Outer Hebrides. Thanks, pal.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a pretty kind of unsavoury lot in there, and it got half exposed. So suddenly, actually, the National had this story, as they point out themselves, ages ago, and explored it all, big front page and everything, which obviously went nowhere in the rest of the press. So that suddenly everybody discovered, the rest of the mainstream media found it out earlier this week and gave it sort of laldy. So there you go. Well done, the National. But it's just a measure of how much it's news where you are, because whatever makes news here, and particularly with the National, it seems to kind of, get nowhere with the rest of the UK.
But I mean, it was a ridiculous story. Why did they commission this in the first place? The story that was published in the Times about their funding was absolutely bang to rights, was completely accurate. They were fined by the Electoral Commission in the end. So it wasn't as if it was some kind of very partisan piece or something that was kind of dodgy or skirted the kind of outer edges of actually credible. You had kind of one, inverted commas quote that you'd sort of hung a whole article around, and who are these guys and what are they actually trying to do to us, and we need to understand more about the background here. This was a kind of blatant attempt to smear these journalists and to pass stuff along to GCHQ and accuse them of being involved in a Russian hack, which turned out to be a whole load of absolute tripe, just to deflect attention away from their own dodgy dealing.
Yeah. But did you hear the Reform UK press conference, which, as predicted, had... Yes, Robert Jenrick is the shadow, they're calling it Shadow Chancellor, which is, everyone's pointing out, actually every party calls their bunch shadow everythings, but still a bit cheeky, and liable to cause a little bit of an upset, since there's quite a few other guys in there that thought they had their sort of pause on that one. But I see that what's flashing as news at the moment is Suella Braverman, who is education equality, whatever,
skills,
says that she would repeal the Equality Act. So they're kind of, jumping in the deep end there. Just, but I suppose at least they're picking up what they think they're on a roll because of, the screw up with the local government stuff. Now it was already scheduled, their press conference for, the announcing of the big roles in their party. The only thing you'd have to say is that there've been quite a few people on the opinion poll front who are sort of still spotting that actually Reform have been flatlining. And if anything, support for Farage has been actually, as an individual, has been in decline. I mean, let's not kind of get everybody excited yet. But, so it's a small decline, but it's a fairly consistent trend. And so perhaps that explains today's stuff, because the feeling is that if everything falls, rises and falls on the strength of Farage, then you've got a bit of a problem. So now they've got other actors, in the front line. Although you've got to say they're the ones that you've they're soiled Tories and people that you've already heard. I mean, if they were going to impress you, they would do. It might well be because the whole issue of immigration has actually gone down the news agenda with a whole lot of other stuff. And, just possibly the fact that there's no clarity from them as to what they would cut yet, because that will be the moment when quite a lot of would-be supporters might well look at the proposals and think, I rely on that income. So they might well not be stupid enough to actually get down to that level of detail, but they will find themselves being pushed to do it. So, it works both ways. And I did love the fact that by the end of, I was listening to this morning, I think it was 5 Live, when they came on to their news bulletin at the top of the hour, when they were announcing these new cabinet posts for Reform. This was all knocked into a cocked hat by the sad news that Jesse Jackson, the civil rights leader in the States, had died. And so there's tremendous poetic justice in this, because here's a bluntly racist party, who are proposing to ditch the Equality Act, and doubtless others besides, pipped at the post by, a very dignified man, Jesse Jackson, who, has been a prominent part of American life since Martin Luther King.
Absolutely, and quite poetic irony that he managed to sort of dominate the news cycle one last time and bump them. I mean, it makes sense, I suppose, from Reform's perspective that they, in terms of the media understanding of how the party is structured and who to go to for quotes and things, you have an identified spokesperson following the same kind of opposition rubric that everybody else does. The SNP didn't previously have shadow spokespersons when they were in the Commons. It was only laterally, I think I'm right in saying, under Ian Blackford that they took on actual shadow roles. So they tended to have more modern names in 2015 when they were the third largest party. Kind of Justice and Home Affairs spokesperson rather than shadow Home Secretary, for example. But it made it more difficult for the press to understand who you were and what you were actually doing. So whilst you were actually shadowing and you were in there for questions on business and trade because you were the shadow business and trade person, you had some other kind of slightly jazzier, more modern title before they went, and I think I'm right in saying under Blackford and had shadow titles. But then, of course, more true believer indie yesers felt that was kind of part of a slide into adopting a Westminster system. I don't think it did represent that. I think it was just to provide kind of clarity for press and people looking to kind of take your views on things in opposition to other spokespeople of other parties who were doing the same kind of job as you.
Meanwhile, it's extraordinary how quickly all this has gone, because it feels like 1,000 years ago when Anna Sarwar basically stood up and tried to, bullet Kier Starmer. But actually, that is also, all of the aftermath of that has still been sitting across the week. I was listening to the Sunday show and Anna Sarwar was on. I don't know if it's just me, but, politicians who just keep repeating things like a kind of mantra, it is probably my total bête noire. I was finding myself almost sort of going, I just can't listen to this again, especially this business of him, deciding that he was doing what he was doing for Scotland. I mean, just no.
A lot of wry comments about your Saltaire underpants from last week caused a lot of excitement.
But he said this extraordinary thing. I was just about to switch it off because I thought this is just unlistenable. And I mean, who actually out there, if you're listening to it, you've got the first time, that he did this for Scotland, that this is where he was born, that this is what it's all about for him. And he does this in such kind of, I can't mimic his way of speaking, which just goes in these really, units of thought that kind of, so it's all like, I get this sort of mental image of a bairn that's reluctant to eat, and you're kind of just shoveling the kind of spoon in one after the other. And finally, when I was just about to give up, he said to, I think, I can't remember, no, it was Gary Robertson. He says, the Westminster bubble will always think, what does this mean for Westminster? And I thought, you're having an actual laugh, because there's exactly the case for independence. And you've just said it.
Completely. And as you said,
I did tweet this and it's had a fair old bit of traction, but that, and I noticed other people have picked it up as well and gone for it. But it's like, there's the thing, because the piece that I'd written was sort of just asking this point as well. What they've done is have a little courage, which is a very dangerous thing. It's not enough to reach dry land with a standalone Scottish party. Not that would actually work for most of us, that have just left that idea behind. All they've done is muddy the waters permanently, not just Scottish waters but British waters. Well done. And whether or not any of this really kind of helps Anna Sarwar's credibility, it's really hard to see, because actually almost the proof of his kind of inconsequential standing even within Scotland, even in the run-up to Scottish elections, is that the U-turns by Kier Starmer are still outdoing him in terms of publicity.
Aye. And still hasn't actually managed to get really anybody more from his MP group, or really even his MSP group, to be more full-throated in their support of him. So they are now constantly in any media appearance having to ride two horses of supporting the Prime Minister and supporting Anna Sarwar, or as all these Vox Pops showed, I'm Anna Sarwar is the Scottish leader and I support Anna Sarwar. Yes, but do you support his stance on Kier Starmer? And again, just keep robotically repeating, I support Anna Sarwar. And you're like, answer the bloody question. And Anna Sarwar, as you say, just seems to kind of speak in media gobbets. He's gone through in the morning and learnt the kind of 10 phrases that the Labour press team have put together for him, assuming that those would be bullet points, which he would sort of string together with his own eloquence. And instead of stringing them together, he just kind of staccatically repeats each of the bullet points again and again and again. It doesn't seem to be able to go anywhere with them. Or kind of flex and use it.
Doesn't develop arguments at all. I've got to say, listening as somebody who used to be an interviewer, there's so many points where I would just dive in because you know where he's going to go now. He's just going to keep repeating that stuff. I would love to just ask him, in what way is you deciding to do something for your party political benefit in the interest of Scotland? Just can you spell that out? Because I can see that you think you run in Scotland's good for Scotland. So ergo, anything that helps you helps Scotland. See, if I put that one up in logic when I was doing it back in the day, I think that would be seen as a bit of a kind of non sequitur. But I would love to hear him spell it out because we're just letting him, the media is just letting him repeat this stuff. And I know, again, from having been sitting in that chair, when you get this kind of automaton-y sort of reply, something in you slightly, it's a kind of combination of goes to sleep and it just gets numbed by it, but your job is to not do that and just keep having something where you're really listening to all the presumptions there are in every sentence there. And actually the other thing is, that thing about Westminster, that should be hurled back at him in the next interview he's in and asked to elaborate as to why you would not therefore be voting for independence or setting up a separate party. And the other thing is, then you realise how much, how desperate they are to keep Starmer. And of course they are, but just consider who's being thrown onto the bus here. It's not just Anna Sarwar and the whole of Scottish Labour. It's Labour candidates in Wales, English councils, the Manchester by-election, although Labour apparently think they're going to keep Denton. But all of that is worth keeping a guy who within days has got another couple of U-turns under his belt and very possibly still won't make it very far. But you, in the meantime, all those other local, as they keep sweeping us into, contests are of no significance because they will still be any attempts to have local campaigns, national campaigns, Scottish, Welsh, anything campaigns will all be overrun by him.
Indeed, and they're also being undermined electorally at the moment, I think, with the continued fallout from the Pam Duncan Glancy problems and the way that that's been handled, and reports today showing that they kind of stood aside in Murray when that the chap that she was supporting, the convicted paedophile, was contested re-election in between two different.
But he stood as an independent.
He stood as an independent, and they kind of
against him.
Stood aside. It was the only area in Scotland where they didn't have candidates, and just kind of let him have a free run. So there's a constantly generating headlines that they don't want, and questions that are difficult to answer, whilst not really providing any kind of sure electoral footing or policy making or speechifying to elucidate what it is they think they're going to do. There's no credibility left for Labour in Scotland, and I don't know what it's going to do after the Scottish elections to maintain any kind of relevancy rather than just sort of disappear altogether.
Yeah, I guess they're all, now they're just all psychologically just going to get over that hump and then have to sit and decide how much they're going to regroup. But I'm just remembering my other absolute kind of point where it's just started fuming was actually watching Prime Minister's questions last week. And it was quite an incredible, because this was everybody. Do you remember we were saying, wow, this will be interesting to see how Kier Starmer handles it. And basically, he just tried to dish the dirt to everybody who stood up and said anything. And I don't know whether that works anymore, at all. I mean, when Ed Davey had a quite, reasonable point at him, he said, yeah, you guys gave us austerity. You screwed everything up when you were in league with the Tories, and don't you say a blooming thing, my man. In fact, if he'd said it like that, sort of off the cuff way, it might have got somewhere. But he also had a real go at Stephen Flynn after he'd come out with this rubbish, Starmer, about, I will never walk away from the country that I love. And again, what? Who is equating you? I mean, I think the column I just put something like, this is giving you this vision that Kier Starmer is some brave lone sapper defending Britain's last redoubt from enemy fire. And he just isn't. Nobody's he's allowing himself to be equated with some loyalty to the country. And okay, you could spell out that if he goes, there could be instability and the markets might not like it and there's nobody standing in the wings and blah, blah, blah. But you cannot once again just melt these things all down to be the same. Because if that was true, you would just cancel elections. Because they'll all end up having instability and whatever, and you're the bee's knees and all the rest of it. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, he did have a go at Stephen Flynn then, saying, yeah, where will you be with Peter Murrell? Which, of course, he was smacked down for because that's a live issue. It's still a live issue because it's been bumped on the case until after the May elections.
It has. So I'm not sure what much we can actually say about it, because obviously it is a pending case. There's been lots of speculation as to why it's been bumped off until after the May elections, and calls by the Tories for the Crown Office to explain this, although there's equally much more sensible reporting suggesting that actually it was not the Crown, not the prosecution that wanted it delayed, but rather Peter Murrell's defence team who wanted more time, which I think is much more likely and much more credible, and it might be that they need to do extra work on his defence or decide how he's going to handle the trial. Don't know whether he's unwell or any of these sort of things. I think it's far more likely that it was Peter Murrell, Croatian, Peter Murrell there causing the delay rather than the Crown. We obviously got more details of the case, which I think is probably very upsetting for most yesers and certainly for many members of the Scottish National Party, about the kind of level and the nature of the alleged fraud. Part of which perhaps also explains some of the kind of more, proactive SNP comments complaining about the blue tent and what have you, and where was the blue tent for Mandelson, and this was all just designed to embarrass. But the nature of the charge sheet and the spending on actual tangible home goods perhaps explains why they needed an evidence tent to process a kind of volume of bulky materials in a way that wouldn't have been relevant if you were looking for kind of a couple of old Blackberries and what have you to find out what messages had been exchanged by Peter Mandelson. So this is it's a real shock. It's a huge volume of alleged fraud. This was money that yesers thought was going to be ring-fenced and carefully husbanded ahead of a future referendum campaign. And people who complained about this and who tried to ask questions and tried to make inroads into the actual way that the party was being managed, or as they understood saw it being mismanaged, were rebuffed, were treated as rebels, and were kind of pilloried, wished for Indy. The finance team, the kind of financial oversight committee of the SNP, if you remember, resigned. Such hotheads and dreadful people as the SNP Lord Provost of Edinburgh, prominent business people who were members of the Chartered Institute of Directors and Chartered Institute of HR and what have you, people that had reputations to maintain, said that they couldn't be part of the Finance and Oversight Committee because they felt they weren't getting the information from Peter Murrell. And people even like Wings Over Scotland, who stuck out in my memory when I was looking through the recent reporting were saying, how on earth can the SNP spend this amount of money on Apple Macintosh products? You'd basically, if you look, we've got a list of how many staff they've got here. You need to have given them an iPad, a desktop, a top of the range Apple laptop, and something else each, and you still couldn't get up to that amount of money. And one of the allegations in the charge sheet, as it's been reported, is that actually was a false invoice for something like 12 grand's worth of Apple goods, which was falsified in order to allow funds to be diverted elsewhere and for the purchase of cars. So, I mean, it's a really dreadful situation. And I think a lot of people will have to do some soul searching about how individuals and party members who try to point at problems and say, we need to just get this sorted, were treated.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's plenty of us, Commonweal certainly had editorial after editorial about the kind of way that Peter Murrell was running the place, but myself. But it wasn't so much at that point because nobody would know the ins and outs of the finances, but just the kind of hands off, it's mine, and the incredible focus on just money making within the party, which ended up charging actually bits of the party, never mind anybody else, commercial rates to even have a stall at their own conference or an event, which was the thing I couldn't get over. That how could you even call that a sort of democratic party? But anyway, I don't know how much there's been, changed within all of that, because quite a few of the people that were really involved with that, I'm thinking one guy particularly whose name's just jumped out of my head, who was one of who set up a Commonweal branch within the SNP, Craig Berry, I think, was it? Because he then went to Alba, and I noticed, of course, just while we're at it, that Alba have had to report an alleged fraud to the police this week. Which in fact it was Kenny McCaskill, the party leader, confirming that. So there's not huge amounts of detail, on what's happened there, but somebody whose sources told the paper, this has left us clinging on by our fingernails. We will survive, but, just running up to an election campaign. And there's been a couple of people who sort of stood down and out of things, Gail Henry and Christina being Alex Salmon's niece, who did a tremendous job of a tribute to Alex at the memorial service for him in St. Giles. And Gail, her mum, Alex's sister, is that right?
That's correct.
So they, without getting too far into it, I think they both stood back. Well, however you might describe that
just
properly.
Be clear, I think so. As far as I understand from reporting, Gail has stood back from an elected position on the NEC, but remains a party member. And Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh, not Christina Henry, but Tasmina, has stood down for personal reasons, as reported from the chairmanship of the party, but both remain Alba members. Christina Henry was expected to be the top of the regional list in the northeast, and Kenny McCaskill seems to have used his power as leader to put himself into the top position on that list. And it's not clear whether Christina's actually going to contest one of the only constituency seats for Alba, because Alba took a strategic decision not to stand in constituencies and to only stand on the list, so that there was no danger of them being accused of interfering with the SNP's constituency vote. But it's not an ideal time to be running an election, and I suppose people were hoping, or some people were hoping or expecting to see more of a cut through from Alba this year. But if they don't have the money to put themselves out there, we're not going to see that.
There's also, just while we're talking on the kind of people that make you scream at the radio, we've missed out Jim Radcliffe.
Well, let's just focus. We'll get to him in just a second. I noticed also very recently that the Alliance for Liberation of Scotland, so this was Liberate Scotland, has now been confirmed as a party by the Electoral Commission just at the beginning of February there. just the last week or so, has now been confirmed that they're able to stand as an electoral force under the Liberate Scotland banner, although I think they've had to call themselves Alliance to Liberate Scotland in order to meet the requirements of the Electoral Commission. So they will be fielding candidates on the list as well, and I think are also hoping to be a vehicle, a kind of non-party vehicle at any future democratic event in order to secure independence. That was an amalgamation of ISP, I think, Independence for Scotland Party, Independence for Independence, and Sovereignty. But I think, quite fairly, a very, very small electoral grouping who will equally struggle to get any cut through other than within the very good networks of yes groups and supporters of independence.
Yeah. I mean, this is the problem with groupings that have not got in one sentence or even just two words exactly what they're about as parties. And I've got to say that is the problem if we're talking earlier about, reforms problem, if it happens down the line, is that, all its money are on the Nigel Farage square. So if he, he slacked off big style when he was, not interested for long periods of time. I was even searching at one point for, does Nigel Farage actually want to be Prime Minister? Because you'd wonder, with his whack rate in other parliaments he's been elected to. But so you've got all of that kind of focus on a leader, and obviously Alba had the same with Alex, and it had definitely got policies. I'm talking about in the past tense. It still does have policies that are different, but all the groups there need to have something that in one or two words or policies just sums up what they're about. The Greens, pretty good name there. Love them, hate them, clues in the name. And okay, you could then say they've drifted, the difficulties have been when they've drifted too far away from that core concept, because the planet still needs somebody to be agitating for it, for sure. Labour still, they don't do what it says on the can, and they've been punished for that because people had a strong conception about what Labour should be. Tories, Now, the problem for these other groups are that you need very quickly to say why you should be voting for them, not the SNP. And it needs to be more than a personality issue, because eventually people go, Yeah, and
I
that's
suppose
the difficulty for everybody now is what actual issues and things do you really want to bring to the fore? Because meanwhile, back at the front, going right forward, back to the beginning of this podcast, there are some very real issues in Scotland about how we're running this country, and none of them get an airing because everybody is having slight shades of grey, valid shades of grey for sure, about exactly how you might push independence further.
And I suppose that's what Alliance for Liberation would say, that Liberate Scotland, as I think they'll campaign as, that they're not interested in any of that crap, that they're there to bolster a mainstream movement in the Scottish Parliament, or to fight a Westminster election purely on the ticket of independence, and that their independence nothing else, and that they're not interested in being distracted by Westminster, machinations, that they're entirely focused on independence, and that I suppose their central pitch is that the SNP particularly has allowed itself to become too moribund by the kind of administration of Scottish devolution rather than pushing forward for independence. But it will be very difficult, unfortunately, for a group like that to cut through, because they won't get the mainstream airtime. They're not standing on the constituencies as Liberate Scotland, as far as I understand, a lot kind of confusingly to me, and I need to dig into this more. I think some of them will be standing in their original parties. So this is an alliance, so Independence for Independence, Sovereignty, and the Independence for Scotland Party, ISP, Colette Walker. I think some of these individual members are intending to stand in the constituency under their own party name, and then separately under the alliance banner on the list. Now, normally, in terms of kind of electoral advantage, you wouldn't do that. If you were standing in a constituency and on the list, you would be doing that predominantly so that you could kind of focus on a particular constituency and spend and do as much campaigning as you're legally allowed to do in that constituency. And even if you weren't able to take the constituency seat, that some of those votes that you got would carry across onto the list. So people say, well, actually, I'm going to vote for my SNP candidate in the constituency because I want them to be my constituency MSP. But I'm going to, instead of giving you my constituency vote, I will give you my list vote. But all that kind of campaigning and material that's come through, or adverts that you've been exposed to during the course of that campaign, carries forward and gives you a kind of double dunt in that constituency area. It'd be slightly unusual if they stand, as Independents for Scotland on the constituency, with a particular candidate, and then have to sort of divide their marketing and their spend, which will be very small naturally, into a second brand, which would be Liberate Scotland. It would normally be better sense to have those aligned so that any amount of kind of positive goodwill that you generate for one translates across from one vote to the other.
I mean, the other way, another way of looking at this, much as I'm a great believer in the only thing that puts the wind up the SNP, to be blunt, is the prospect of electoral challenge.
Yep.
But my issue is, will this amount to an electoral challenge? And if it isn't, will you just put years of your life into this and find yourself damage your health, damage everything? I said this to Colette Walker, I've got to be honest, right at the start, that this is going to be so hard for you to have an impact. And this is again where you might think, an alternative is to have a movement. Anyway, that one is also difficult, but there's an event that is sold out now, actually, on the 14th of March in Glasgow in the Oran Moor. It's the Independence Forum Scotland and Yes United. So that's sold out as a kind of, I'm speaking at it, and so it looks like it's quite a frisky daytime gig. However, the evening event is still got tickets for that. If anybody's interested, this is being arranged with Artists for Scottish Independence. These guys sort of re-energised to try to kind of get the cultural aspect of Yes working again. So there's a great lineup there with Eddie Reader, Bobby Bluebell, loads of really good bands. So we'll put the ticket link in the notes, and that might be the beginning of something interesting.
And I hope so. There's some cracking lineup, it has to be said, and it should be well worth going to see. And as a good sort of jumping off point to recapture some of the cultural moves that were made around the sort of 2012 to 2014 campaign, and that kind of joyousness that we were able to experience during the referendum. And with Yes, it's still climbing slowly in the polls. Now is a very good time to push forward. I'm really interested to see what's going to come out during the election, although I see some other mainstream commentators saying that actually there's really no electoral advantage to John Swinney mentioning independence at all at the moment, because the Labour Party are doing such a good job of defeating themselves that actually pointing out problems to sections of the electorate that might not support you is not actually a good idea. You're like, well, so what? This is what we need to see as a country, and it's what independent supporters need to see in order to believe that it's worthwhile coming out and voting for these established independent supporting parties. And if they don't see it, I think the turnout is going to be low, and there's certainly not going to be any prospect of the SNP getting its majority on its own. But,
I mean, there's an excitement issue here, folks.
Yeah.
Which is, that is really hard to create, especially when you've had false dawns and people can't quite see a finishing line. But there's definitely got to be some excitement put back into this. And it's mentioning and weaving independence into arguments. I've got to say, Dave Dugan was on this morning, the defence spokesperson for the SNP, doing very well, I thought, with all the difficulty at the moment with the world the way it is. Having to articulate the anti-nuclear stance of the SNP very well, actually. and no shrinking from it. He brought the argument up before it was put to him by the interviewer, and really making very sound points about the lack of investment in all forms of defence for Scotland, and mentioning independence, I would say, about 12 times, actually, in a 3-minute interview, but making it relevant, where he was even making the point that we don't have, at the moment, any of the defensive ships around the shores of Scotland, despite the obvious incursions of Russian vessels. There's special stuff having to be flung up for Facesuth because the regular patrol is not there anymore for us, and that an independent Scotland would put that top. So that was a pretty good example, actually, of just weaving that in very naturally and talking constantly about the future, which would be different, until the interviewer herself was beginning to phrase it like that, which is well done, actually. And I still want to say Jim Radcliffe is an absolute. There's a fabulous column, I mean, which Paul Kavanagh wrote. It's just such a brilliant kind of takedown. If you missed it, this is Jim Radcliffe, who owns practically everything and Ineos at kind of closed Grangemouth.
But he's a job creator, Leslie.
He moved to the tax haven of Monaco to avoid paying tax in 2020, and then started pontificating on Sky News about the UK being colonised by immigrants. There's a fabulous wee phrase here that Paul's got, where it seems when he's talking about him living in Monaco, he doubtless is one of those English folk living abroad who considers himself an expat and not an immigrant. And he says it's equally likely he doesn't speak much French in his daily life and has done the square root of bugger all to integrate into the local community, which is exactly what he's criticising Britain for. So I hope people are able to see that level of, just the duplicity, double standards, whatever. But of course, nobody stuck it to him that I noticed during interviews.
No, and he's apologised, but of course he's apologised for offence caused by his language, not on what he actually said. It's one of these kind of non-apologies. It's like when you get your children to apologise to each other. It's an absolute load of mince. But it's a kind of totally construed, made up argument that has been sort of put about, particularly in the US, but also here, and also the US about Europe, that, its immigration policies are going to lead to a failure of culture, and some kind of, takeover, and a lot of kind of fear-mongering nonsense. It's an odd time to be alive, particularly when you're getting somebody who's axed, all of our sovereign capability in petrochemicals being described as a job creator by Fiona Bruce, and maybe we need to stop and listen to him. She's obviously playing devil's advocate, of course, but I mean, you're like, sorry, what?
Yeah, I noticed also that the UK government has spent 600 million quid improving infrastructure around Old Trafford. Jings, who owns Manchester United? And again, usefully, Paul notes something like 73% of immigrants in the UK are working and paying a greater percentage of income in tax than Jim Radcliffe.
I thought you were going to say our footballers there forever. He's certainly in a lot of hot water at Manchester United for attacks on immigration, given the makeup of their squad. Indeed. I mean, what a load of tripe. But yeah, just an appalling situation, and rightly condemned. But we're also seeing very slow movement and the kind of rehabilitation of Grangemouth as a kind of manufacturing base. Lots of pontificating by the UK government, but not too much in the way of action. It's not that long ago that we were talking about the fact that he'd been given a whole lot of UK money in order to go and do stuff in France.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yes, everybody keep this in mind.
Well, we're just coming up over the hour. We'll definitely make sure we get those links up to that night, the Yes United. I mean, this type of activity, Yes United and the Alliance to Liberate for Scotland, as a non-party vehicles or collaborative vehicles, are going, in my view, going to be critical once we come past the 2026 Scottish election and start seriously thinking now and looking forward towards 2029, and that Farage shadow cabinet becoming the real UK cabinet, and the type of damage and social rupture that that's going to cause.
Mm-hmm. Well, but they won't become the UK cabinet in the run-up to the Westminster election.
They won't, but this is what the Westminster election will be in 2029. Will be either a clapped out Kier Starmer that somehow miraculously managed to limp on and has resetted his reset of the reset, or a Labour Party candidate that nobody actually voted for, implementing a manifesto that they had to make up after the election, midway through a term, versus a kind of very slick, well organised and very moneyed Faragist reform.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with that. It's just, I thought somehow I'd missed an election in there, but
no, I mean,
it ain't over till it's over, and especially not for us.
Indeed not. But I mean, I think, people, once they're more able in their kind of headspace to look beyond the elections, and once the Scottish parliamentary election has passed, we will have to redouble our efforts. And remember that, people have been campaigning for independence all of their lives in many regards, but the actual, big push for independence was a kind of 3-year campaign that bubbled up from 2011 and the launch in 2012 through to 2014. Equally, I think the campaign period between the 2026, so after the 26 Scottish election, and the lead up to the 2029, or perhaps slightly earlier, UK general election will be a really critical time. And it's a time where, yes, groups need to learn to come back together, and that will require the SNP to give up a degree of control and come and be an equal player in that, rather than trying to be a kind of dominating factor. Right,
that's a bit of a big one to launch at the end of the podcast, but we'll come back to that.
I think there'll be more to that in the coming months and years, but it certainly looks to be the direction of travel. And on that enigmatic note, we'll see you next week, chums.